good morning or good afternoon, whatever time it is. By the time this gets to you, it's probably going to be afternoon. We are diving into your oldest daughter's chart today, and we are going to talk a lot about her inherent potential, a lot of the natural characteristics that are going to be associated with her throughout her development, and talk a lot about her future. And we'll talk about lightly some life purpose stuff. And we'll also talk about some of those major transits that happen around this age, what you kind of can expect over the next couple of years, and areas of focus and major life themes in her life. So that's primarily what we're going to talk about today with the premium natal chart reading. Thanks so much again for getting a lot of gifts and referring people. That definitely warranted getting a good discount on a reading. So I was more than happy to do this for you. So we have so much to get through, so I'm not going to take a ton of time going into an introduction or details, but if there's anything I skim over too fast for the sake of time, just let me know and I will be sure to go back over that or answer that in greater detail. I may also, if I can remember, I'll send you some additional sheets that can kind of help you with certain keywords that I won't necessarily have time to go over. But I'm just going to walk through this chart like I would if someone got a birth chart from me and we were sitting down for a consultation. The only problem with pre-recorded is that usually there's room for questions if you're getting a live consultation, but most of the time the client is just listening in and kind of taking everything in, and then usually questions come up afterwards. But every astrologer has their own style, so it really greatly depends. So anyways, we are going to get into the nuances of this chart. So just walking through it the way an astrologer would, or the way I've been trained to at least, one of the first things I tend to look at is this little grid over here. This is going to talk about the elemental and modality distribution of someone's chart, and this can oftentimes point us to what is a dominant expression that will typically be expressed through a chart like this. So one of the things that we see here is that your child does have a strong fire enhancement, because we have this extra point here that is talking about the ascendant. So this is counting how many planets. Don't worry about the middle column. And then this is talking about the ascendant. So we know that there's going to be 4 points in fire and there's only 1 point in air. So this tells us that your daughter has a emphasis of fire and what we would call an air de-emphasis or an air void. And this is one of those basic constructs that is a really great place to start to at least talk about where your child is going to have some strengths and where they may have some weaknesses in this lifetime. They're pretty balanced in terms of modality, which is really great, but they do have that extra emphasis of cardinal energy because they have 4 points there with that additional point for the ascendant. So this definitely shows us that your daughter is going to strongly express herself, typically in an Aries way, which is associated with her ascendant. And what's really interesting about that is because her sun is in Capricorn and she's also got 2 other planets there, and it's also in a very visible spot. So just looking and seeing 3 planets in Capricorn, you would assume Capricorn would be that planet that gets emphasized, that sign that gets emphasized, but it's truly going to be Aries at the end of the day. When push comes to shove or on instinct, your child will lean into the fire cardinal expression. And just to go over really quickly what the modalities represent and what the elements represent. Fire represents will and passion and conscious energy. Earth tends to represent groundedness and resourcefulness and stability. Air is typically associated with the mind, intellect, and thought. So rationality and logic are also associated with air. And water is all about feeling, emotions, creativity, and depth. Expression goes along with fire and water, and then air and earth are typically more pragmatic. Water and earth are feminine elements, and fire and air are masculine elements. And that just means, in terms of masculine and feminine, that masculine is more extroverted or outward pushing, and feminine is more absorbing or passive. So we can see that there is going to be more of like an overt expression with the fire emphasis. Cardinal energy starts all the seasons, so part of the equinoxes. So typically cardinal signs are really self-initiating and self-motivated and driven towards leadership. Fixed signs are stabilizing forces, and they tend to represent concreteness and consistency. And then mutable signs enhance mutability. So typically these people are really inquisitive or ingenious, and they typically have a lot of versatility, but they're very adaptive. So that's kind of how you will explain this sort of balance. But particularly because there's an emphasis of fire and a lack of air, we do want to go over that briefly. So children with a strong fire emphasis, again, they will really exhibit qualities of will, spirit, freedom, consciousness, and energy. And so it's really important with children who have an emphasis of fire, which my youngest daughter does. They need lots of space for growth. So something that parents or anyone who's raising this child or is going to be an active part in this child's life, the more you try to hem in and kind of close in around a strong fire child, the more they will lash out and rebel. So typically you don't need to overly discipline them. I've also noticed just in my own, experience with my own fire emphasis daughter, that she's someone that has to kind of learn from hard knocks. And that's because fire energy can be a bit idealistic. So you kind of can't warn, like, you can't really use fear against like a fire child. It doesn't typically work for them. It's not really going to be their style. So it's really important to provide explanations for rules and actions, not just a because I said so type of thing. You have to really kind of be very transparent and avoid like emotionally charged or like infusing emotions into discipline where it's not appropriate. But you're often going to see a rebellious nature with fire energy. That is just something, in fact, to the point where when my daughter was born, I ended up laughing when I pulled her birth chart, because I pulled her birth chart as soon as I was like able to. And I was like, really, universe, this is what you give me? So she was supposed to be like heavy earth, but it didn't happen that way. So they tend to be pretty forthright, open, and prefer honesty. So that's always going to be the best way to lead in parenting. And there is typically a lot of enthusiasm. And so these kids need typically to feel like their excitement is matched, which can be difficult. Be sure to be on the lookout for typical challenges with fire strength children, which are going to include rebelliousness, insensitivity, and occasional aggressiveness or assertiveness, particularly over the will of other children or siblings. That is something that you'll typically see with the fire emphasis. So it really depends on each child, though. My daughter doesn't tend to assert the aggressiveness as much, but she is rather small. So I mean, like, I think, maybe as she gets older, it'll come out more. So for the air, the lack of air placements, this can sometimes be made up for if the typical air houses, which are, you have the 3rd, 7th, and 11th. If those houses are well emphasized, sometimes that can help. But the moon sign is in an air sign, which is pretty good. So these blue ones tend to represent air signs, and then these sort of greenish ones are water. The red ones are fire, obviously, and then these like brownish ones, yellow ones are earth typically. So there is at least the moon in an air sign, so that is a positive. So if you're only going to have one planet, to represent, at least it's one of those core planets. So, but a deficiency in air can mean an inability to think clearly or reasonably. So there could be, particularly if there was a strong emphasis in water, which there is stronger water in this chart than there is air. So we could reasonably think that. It could be difficult to detach themselves from their own point of view. And this is especially important because the only air placement is in the sun, is in the planet. The moon is the only planet in an air sign in this chart. And the moon tends to be subjective because it's a lot about our emotional state and how we relate to things. So we also see that that is going to be a possibility here. So that can be something that is lacking. What I have found more than any other void or deficiency, though, with air in particular, this actually strives the native or the individual, in this case the child, to actually develop those skills more so. And I think it depends on the state of the world, but I have an air void in my chart as well. I actually have not a single planet in air. And I have found that definitely, and my north node's in air too. Your daughter and I have inverse north node, south node, north nodes. So I find I draw a lot of north node Leo people to me. So I can definitely shed some lessons on that. But I find that I strive even more so to be rational. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'll tend to be subjective. So I try to strive really hard to detach from my emotions, especially in a professional setting. So this is something that can be overcome, but in childhood in particular, this might be somewhat of a struggle. This doesn't mean that your child will not be able to empathize, though. That's a different thing. But the process of thinking is likely going to be more self-focused or self-guided. Okay, and then the cardinal emphasis is going to talk a lot about typically this is going to be a child that enjoys taking initiative and typically doesn't like to slow down for others. They really kind of want to charge in head first. There can be an impulsivity sometimes with cardinal signs. You also get this with mutable signs as well. Fixed signs tend to be like the voice of reason. But there is a struggle to sustain effort. Now this would be more so if there was a lack of fixed modality, but that's not the case. So, but this is something that you may have to build the skill of consistency. It's not something that may be the most natural instinct for her. And they typically like to be first or get a spotlight of some kind. They don't like to wait, and they don't like to feel like an afterthought. They need to feel like people intentionally think of them. So sometimes kids with a strong cardinal emphasis will avoid group activities or avoid activities where there's a lot of this push for equality, unless the cardinal sign represented is Libra, which in this case it's not. Then Libra has a little bit of a different approach. But these kids like to be able to take charge or have more responsibilities. And they might at times lack tact is something we also see, especially if Cancer is not strongly represented. Now, Cancer is on the bottom of the chart, which is representative of the environment of the childhood. And typically this can show that mom or family, either there's a very sensitive member of the family, so the child learns a lot about tact and sensitivity through that family member, or this is sort of like the core tenets of what a parent tries to instill in their child, or the type of environment, which typically with Cancer, especially because there's no afflictions here, this is typically going to be parents wanting to instill a very nurturing environment. It's also very funny, your daughter and I have the exact same degree for our 4th house. I find that interesting. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the big 3. That was just my introduction. I don't have time to talk about the other thing I wanted to talk about, which is a shame, but I want to make sure that I have plenty of time to go through this. So we always start with the big 3 because it's going to talk a lot about the core tenets. Then I will go through all the other planets. Then I will go through all the major aspects. I won't maybe have time to get to all of them. Then I'll talk about transits. So one of the first things we see is Aries is the rising sign. So Libra is on the descendant. We talk about this in the soulmate reading. So you'll find that, throughout life, Juliana will begin to focus in more on the tenets, lessons, and themes of Aries. And she will sort of, this will be an area that will be underdeveloped, the area of Libra intensity or Libra themes. And Libra themes are all about like focus on others, focus on equality, rationality, fairness, justice. Those are lots of core Libra tenets: harmony, unity, and this is typically harmony, like harmony of thought or harmony of communication, social harmony, right? Like those are strong tenets of Libra, because Libra is an air sign, and it's very much about the socialization, the social component. So we see that a lot of the core tenets are going to strive towards being an individual, development of the self, and it's going to be all about being a trailblazer and a pioneer. So Mars rules the chart in this particular case, and Mars is in Scorpio, very, very strong Mars. This child is powerful. Now, what's interesting is that Mars is in the 7th house, and the 7th house is almost kind of like a shadow area of the chart. These are planets that we typically don't like to associate ourselves with. So I find it interesting that she might not have a really good sense of self-awareness, at least in her youth, until she gets older and is able to take on and embrace Mars. And I also have the same placement. I have Taurus rising, it's like 2 degrees, but I have Mars and Scorpio in the 7th as well. And I find that it's interesting where I think there's going to be this dichotomy where at times she'll really want to assert herself and will really want to be a leader and will really want to like draw those lines in the sand, but she may not be very consistent with this, or she may like struggle to actually like follow up those proclamations. So it will be an interesting dichotomy, like almost like she likes to boss people around and will expect them to follow through. That's kind of how I see that, but she will definitely have a lot of immense power. There's a lot of power in this chart I find very interesting. So I hope you've prepared. I'm sure you've already have begun to witness it with her, this amount of strength that this type of chart has. And especially if you aren't expecting it as a parent, you're kind of like, what do I do? Especially girls that have a strong fire emphasis or a strong Mars emphasis. It can be very difficult to come to terms with that if you don't have that yourself, right? So, despite her own internal feelings, she oftentimes will project an image of being self-confident, self-assertive, active, and energetic. And competitiveness drives Aries rising people. Now, sometimes this can be competitiveness with oneself. Sometimes this can be competing for a spotlight or self-expression. Because Mars is in the 7th, this can be oftentimes a comparison game for the Aries rising in this case, where it's like they're constantly evaluating themselves in contrast to their peers. So this will be something that you might need to, I don't want to say you don't want to encourage or nurture this to a degree, but you'll have to make sure you kind of keep it in check, because this can at times become an unhealthy energy if it's not dealt with, or at least not expressed in a healthy way, because that can be a source of unhappiness over time. But that competitive nature is one that will help her to enter into situations where she can be a leader, where someone's looking for that type of assertive energy. But she will have to learn how to refine this approach over time. And oftentimes this will come through accepting defeat and being able to do this in a little bit, bringing in some of that Libra balance, which is typically grace and being very cooperative and being understanding. This will be vital for her to strike that balance towards being successful. So her independence can pose challenges in collaborative efforts. So this is something that you might find is a core life theme for your daughter. Oftentimes, Aries rising people really don't like feeling weak or being perceived as weak. So they typically will brush off sympathies. They oftentimes see it as pity. So she may often be self-deprecating or will conceal her true emotions behind humor. And this can make it difficult for others to connect with her. So her tendency can be to act impulsively or recklessly. but typically this is the most courageous sign of all of the zodiac, and it is probably the most energetic sign of all of the zodiac. So this is a powerful, powerful identity that your daughter is cultivating for herself, and it will definitely come with a lot of interesting situations. With this Uranus here, which we'll go into that later, I find that these individuals have the most interesting stories. Like, I think that she will just have this very colorful, bright, vibrant life, and people will really love to listen to her regale about all her experiences. So I find that to be incredibly intriguing. Okay, so the area of mundane mastery. So the type of characteristics she's hoping to master in this lifetime are Sun and Capricorn. And this is so fascinating because she's got Saturn right there too. So Sun conjunct Saturn. Very, very difficult lot in life. Not to say that this is something that can't be overcome, but the sun is the central focus of the chart, and it wants to illuminate, it wants to shine in this lifetime. But Saturn likes to restrict, and it likes to really cage in anything that it touches. So there may be some like real life circumstances that prevent your daughter at times from being able to fully embody her identity and sort of master these characteristics. There can also be in some ways a resistance internally for her developing these. There could be, she could resist. There could be a little bit with a chart like this with Moon in Aquarius, which we'll talk about in a moment. This could be a chart in which a child is very like, it could be a little bit of like Peter Pan syndrome, where like, I never want to grow up, right? Because Saturn is kind of like a planet that talks about what we like fear or what we resist, but we also feel a sense of responsibility and duty in this area. So there is a duty for her to grow up and do the adult things. And when she does, she will do these things very well. When it comes to adulting, Sun in Capricorn is probably one of the best placements to have, but it does show that this could be a little bit of a late bloomer as well in terms of coming into her own. So definitely it's good to be patient with her. And this will be something that might be difficult in terms of life themes, because she's someone that sees herself as so assertive and so individualistic and so initiating. But to see others possibly achieving things before her could be an element that she struggles with. But we have the Sun in Capricorn in the 9th house. And the 9th house deals with expansion or exploration into areas unknown. Now, this isn't as enigmatic as the 12th and the 8th house. This is typically like into new territory, like knowledge or culture or religions, or it's oftentimes these big abstract constructs that relate to the 9th house. So a lot of her development as a person will likely happen later in life. This is usually around college age when the sun is in the 9th house. And there is a level of seriousness and maturity typically associated with Sun in Capricorn. Now, at this age, she is probably only starting to express some of this Capricorn energy, but with Saturn there, I wouldn't be surprised if you don't see much of it at all. But particularly because the midheaven is in this sign as well, it typically starts to happen around school age when they start you sort of give them to the public system of public education. This is when these tenets start to develop. Sometimes by authority figures or people in the public, she can be perceived as being very polite, well-behaved, or as being older, or like someone to be taken very seriously. There is, but because of this sense of like responsibility, and sometimes Sun Capricorn can also be like from a young age, they were thrust into responsibility, where especially if they have like younger siblings that they kind of help look after, or sometimes there can be that sense of like stepping into responsibility early in life for people with this. So there can be a little bit of envy towards people who are able to just kind of like go about life in a little bit more of a carefree way, or people who are more free-spirited, because oftentimes for someone who has a chart like this, they don't feel like they have the opportunity to be truly free-spirited. But a lot of what I believe she'll want to cultivate in her life through responsibilities is being able to have freedom, because the ninth house is associated with tenets of freedom. So she believes that through hard work, and through putting a lot of effort towards what needs to get done, she can sort of be rewarded with being able to explore those things that truly interest her. So that is going to be something that you'll typically see with this. So as she goes older, she'll aspire to achieve tangible and significant accomplishments. So that's a really big thing with Capricorn energy. Oftentimes it's a very vocationally focused planet. So she will really, this period of life, college, is going to be a very important experience for her, where there's going to be a lot of self-discovery at that age. And she will be driven by a strong ambition to excel. Typically, over time, she'll develop core traits of being practical and pragmatic, focusing on what's real and valuable. And she'll have a preference for studying things that have a practical application. And this is interesting because we will talk about, Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius in the 8th house, square Neptune. That's a doozy, right? So she'll have probably a vested interest in things that are like unconventional, that seemingly don't have a practical application, but she will oftentimes always try to find a way to convert some sense of usefulness out of everything that comes across her path. So she might also really align with tenets of like knowledge is power. When she's younger, she may not realize this quite yet. This will be something that will kind of become an epiphany over time. And she might begin to start leaning away from this sort of, she'll begin to refine this Aries, instead of just being like compulsive and diving in and asserting through action. She might assert herself through being the most knowledgeable one in the room. But this may not come easily to her, because she has to really develop a lot of the core disciplines in order to be able to pull this off. But this will be something in time she'll be able to do. So she could definitely have a strong curiosity. That's really common when there's a ninth house emphasis. And she might really want to explore a lot of the really big essential questions about life. But her interest can extend to studies or that offer comprehensive insights into the world. So this can oftentimes relate to like philosophy, history, geography, astrology, religion, foreign governments. It can be, she might have an interest in global matters. So the field of law is also pretty strong, or the field of medicine as she gets older can be really strong, or like politics. These are all things that could be a possibility with, especially because these planets are near the midheaven. But she can also surprisingly have, even though she can be a bit pessimistic and critical as she gets older, she might surprisingly have a high tolerance for people's faults and focus on positives. So she's someone who can clearly see when something's wrong, but she might strive to right wrongs. So she might have this, this kind of replaces having a lack of Libra emphasis, which one of the like core tenets is balance. So she might have like a strong sense of like morality or strong sense of justice that she develops as she gets older. And this is probably going to come from having those hard knocks in life from the Aries ascendant. So that's talking a lot about what she's developing into, but what are you sort of experiencing as of now? Like, what are some of these energies that are the core of who she is on a soul level? And oftentimes what we as parents see most with our children, right? Our children very rarely come in expressing their sun sign, unless their sun sign is conjunct their moon or is like right next to the ascendant. Sometimes we can see the sun really strongly, but we're often going to see that moon sign pretty strongly. So moon in Aquarius. So this is, again, another sign that tends to really honor individuality. It has a strong desire for liberation and wants to explore a lot of new ideas and explore a lot of social constructs or social situations. So this is a very friendly and platonic sign typically, and it really loves, group activities. So we find this interesting that on an emotional level, there's a desire to be accepted and there's a desire to fit in to a degree. Maybe not conform. Conform is not what we're looking for, because typically the moon Aquarius wants to stand out, but it wants the moon in Aries wants that sort of special uniqueness to be integral to a group somehow. So it's kind of like they want to stand out and fit in at the same time. And it's a little bit of like a weird sort of like mirroring effect that's happening, where they can oftentimes struggle to find their ideal, but they really have a strong ideal of what they're looking for when it comes to connecting with others. And this moon is right in between the 10th and the 11th house. So we'll find that the desire to stand out or to have certain accomplishments and achievements will win out over conforming and fitting in, but there is going to be typically that desire. So she'll typically value experimentation. So one thing I know about Moon and Aquarius kids is that they're typically tinkerers, or they typically love to like explore, typically intellectually, because it's an air sign. And she might really seek other kids who like the same interests, or other kids who also have similar tenets, to kind of share these experiences with. Because Aquarius kind of has this strong understanding that, that individuality needs the contrast of what is normative to actually be able to stand out. So there is this poignant focus of always sort of including other people, or this aspect of sharing is really important to them. So she definitely enjoys typically friendship groups or being in company with good people, but she's not a follower. So she oftentimes will maybe seek with others that resonate with her, or seek people who aren't really afraid to follow her or follow a line. But again, because typically this type of sign emphasis is so unique, it can be difficult for these individuals to find people who will really follow them. So in some ways, this is kind of a realization that happens, and these children can emotionally detach easily. So she might cycle through friends in her lifetime, and she might be able to flit to different groups, which is totally fine. But she'll definitely have like a desire to kind of have one consistent group, because this is a fixed sign. So she'll place high value on controlling her feelings and solving problems with her intellect. Typically, this is a moon sign that will oftentimes try to intellectualize their emotions. So they don't typically feel their emotions very deeply. This isn't to say that they aren't deep, but it's that there's almost a fear of feeling things too deeply. So they oftentimes will depersonalize. And this is something that you can see quite commonly. And as a parent, sometimes this can be a little bit scary if you are somebody that is quite emotional, or you have a strong water emphasis, because when your child is just so easily like, okay, like on to the next thing, which Moon in Aquarius, it is a fixed sign. So if it feels something deeply, it's not going to be able to move on until it processes what it's thinking, or processes what they're feeling. But my daughter has a little bit of the same ability to detach. And she's just like, okay, like when our dog died, she just like was able to go, okay, like, and I was like a total wreck. But I find that she still thinks about it sometimes, and it does make her sad. So it's just different emotional bases. So despite her preference, though, for intellectual problem solving, she can recognize and accept emotional differences between herself and others, because this is an eye that can typically spot potential and uniqueness in others. So she is oftentimes, Moon in Aquarius is extremely tolerant moon sign. In fact, they oftentimes celebrate diversity, which is really interesting. She might be confused by other people who have a hard time controlling their emotions, because Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, and Saturn is all about control. And so like from a young age, she just might have this really good ability to be able to kind of like turn it on and off almost, and she might be really confused by like a Cancer moon, right? That like it just feels things deeply and just clings, and she'll be like, why can't you just let it go? Or like just sit and have a, sit and ponder and think about it, write a list and move on, right? Like that's kind of moon in Aquarius. Again, they can sympathize, but empathy is a little bit more of a struggle for moon Aquarius than sympathy. This also shows that typically the moon being ruled by Saturn can be can point to this idea that mom, one of the parents, typically mom, is really important in life, particularly about teaching and instilling responsibility. And oftentimes the parent will be very influential about the career choices because the moon is in the 10th house. So you might really focus in on education, right? Because the ruler of the 4th house is in the 10th. So you might be constantly thinking in terms of raising your child, like how can I raise my child so that she can serve the world to the best of her ability, or like she can understand her highest potential. And it's a very interesting because, we're kind of going through a similar theme right now, right? Like we're getting a chart reading for her at a young age so that you understand maybe how you can be the best parent for her as she's growing and developing. So she can, as she gets older with this moon sign, she will develop more into her sun sign, but this is typically the moon in Aquarius in the 10th. This could be somebody who emotionally, what drives her is this ability to be seen or to serve the public somehow, particularly in a way where she's educating or she's striking some sense of rightness or justness in the world. That could definitely be a core tenet for a chart like this. Sometimes this could also be in service of the earth sometimes. So this could be, home services, food services, agriculture, horticulture, things like that, just because the moon relates so strongly with the 4th house, which deals with like land and property and home. So there could be some sort of like domestic flavoring to this, but it really kind of depends on what experiences she has. It's a little too early to kind of predict career stuff, but definitely it'll be working for other people or working for other demographics. That much is absolutely clear because so many of the planets are above the horizon in this chart. So this is an individual, and again, I have a very similar chart. So this is an individual that typically a lot of that self-development is what leads, it sort of paves a path for them to ultimately be some sort of like paragon of service in this lifetime. And it's very important for her to do this with a sense of authenticity with the moon in Aquarius. So she can never be anything other than who she is. So that is going to be an interesting parallel that we'll find in this lifetime. And I will go over again these aspects to the moon because this is also going to be pretty important as well. And what's interesting is, I don't think we talked about, but typically in a chart, the sun or Saturn will represent dad and then the moon represents mom. Typically, sometimes it's inverse. So sometimes with the sun conjunct Saturn, what can shape the identity is the absence of father or seeking father. Because like seeking or like seeking truth is a 9th house tenet. I have 4 planets in the 9th house. So I definitely, it's one of those things that it's something I definitely relate to. So I'm not sure if dad is still in the life or if dad lives overseas, because like the 9th house is like foreign emphasis. So I see she was born in the States, but you guys are not in the States. So I'm curious if that is a thing, in terms of like if dad is really super present. But I would say both parents, even if one parent is absent, is very integral to her identity because both these planets have association with Saturn. So I would say that both parents are extremely, extremely influential. She might have a very strong respect for authority. So even though she can be assertive and impulsive and self-driven and very ambitious, there is still sort of this like reverence for authority in some ways. She might not always love that aspect of herself, but she might come to embrace and understand it and become more neutral about it. But that is Saturn. It plays a huge role in her life, and Saturn is a very important planet in this chart. Okay, so let's go through these other signs. I'll try to be more brief so that we have time to get into the other things. But we're going to talk about some of the other planets and placements. So we have Mercury. Again, Mercury is all about comprehension, communication, learning, and understanding. So Mercury is one of her weakest planets in this chart. Mercury is in the sign of detriment. It is not in the sign of fall, which is good. The sign of fall is Pisces, actually. So that is what the ages would have dictated as being the worst placement, quote unquote. Now, the thing about that a lot of people don't seem to overlook is that when a sign is strongly dignified, like in a positive way or a negative way, regardless of what side of the spectrum it's on, it still makes the planet incredibly strong. So even though it's strong in its detriment, oftentimes this is a planet where you'll see the most development happen with this planet. And a good example is I have the same placement. And I actually used to not speak until the age of 3. And I also had a stutter. And now I speak for my job and I speak pretty clearly, but I had to go through a lot of like linguistic and speech classes to kind of help me because I did have a lot of speech issues as a kid. So that's like an example of, but oftentimes, typically, the way one learns, understands, or comprehends is not aligned with what is normative or what is desired. So particularly for young kids in the school environment, this plays a really important role because typically there is sort of like this standard of education, and oftentimes kids who have Mercury in Sag or Mercury in Pisces tend to not match with what that standard is. And it's because the mutability of these signs where they have a hard time being really consistent, but they also have a hard time being very initiative when it comes to learning things. Like they tend to like kind of like learn things that cross their path almost, like that are thrust upon them, or they learn through a really deep interest that they have. They tend to not learn really well across the board, but this is the potential to really master something. So I find this to be very true in my case. Having Mercury in Sagittarius, although I do have a lot of knowledge about random things, like I have a lot of random trivia, I read a lot. I'm a voracious reader, which is why I make a pretty good astrologer, because you have to read a ton to be a good astrologer. But I find that, in school, I only really excelled in subjects I was really, really interested in. But let's go ahead and talk about this. So Mercury in Sagittarius shows a child whose mind is exceptionally curious and will seek answers to a wide range of questions, and typically will have, again, sort of pointed interest in particular subjects. So the subjects will oftentimes be pointed by the house that it's in. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But this curiosity is an asset, but oftentimes there's difficulty in being able to maintain focus or pay attention to details, because this is a very abstract thinker. This is somebody who typically thinks in very broad strokes and can have difficulties with details. So even right now, as I'm doing this reading for you, I have a baseline script that I'm working off of, not because I don't know the information, but because I have the tendency to like go off on tangents. And I just, my mentor explained it as, squirrel syndrome. Like that is Mercury and Sag to a T. There's that tendency where like the grass is always greener elsewhere. So they have a hard time being very present in the moment. So you can get a lot of daydreamy children with these placements, or children that just at one point they're just like thinking very deeply about something, and then the next moment you can't get them to stay on one subject to save your life. Some people who have this placement do end up later in life getting diagnosed with ADHD or some sort of like attention deficit disorder. I did get diagnosed with it later in life. So it definitely can happen, but particularly because this Mercury is retrograde and it's in the 8th house, I wouldn't even be surprised if this is something that you don't, as parents, become privy to about her until later on, because she might be very good at hiding it, or she might be very good at like disguising that she has like issues paying attention. Or the way it presents doesn't like look like, oh my God, she needs something like right now. You know what I mean? But she can express herself honestly and truthfully, typically. Now the thing about it being in the 8th house though is that like she might oftentimes be really honest, but she may not reveal how she honestly thinks to many people, because the 8th house is sort of like the house of secrets, or house of hidden things. So she might have these interests that help guide how she thinks and perceives the world, but she may not openly share them with everybody. But if you ask her, if you know her well enough, she's typically going to be honest, sometimes to a fault. These kids can hurt your feelings. I'm just gonna put that out there. They can really hurt your feelings. But it's important to understand that the value of Mercury in Sagittarius is recognizing the sincerity that comes with it. In some ways, it's better to be honest and hurtful than it is to be deceptive but tactful. So there's a lot of strength in the way that she can embrace herself in communication and also handle new and unconventional ideas. Similar to Aquarius, Sagittarius is very open to the novel and very open to explore new things. A very inquisitive child. Very, very, very inquisitive. She might ask a lot of questions you as a parent are not going to be prepared for. And one of the things that I would suggest as a parent is say, you know what, honey, I honestly don't know, but we can explore that together, right? But be prepared. She's going to definitely want to dive into things maybe before you're ready. But these can be opportunities for growth and expansion of the mind. And again, I think as she gets into, right before college, I think she's gonna like really hit her stride, because college, I think, is gonna open a new world for her, because you really get to study what you're interested in. Whereas in, primary school and grade school, it's like, ugh, like, oh my gosh, really? Do I really have to do this? And so I think college is going to be this like great opportunity for her. So I think it's important to kind of like give her that perspective a little bit earlier if she's struggling in school. Like, hey, this is not, if you're not the best in this subject, or you do your absolute best, that's all we can ask for. But if you really push and try, this will allow you opportunities to really get to explore what you really want to do. You won't have to learn things you don't like forever. This is kind of just, it's a process that everybody has to go through. And I think if you kind of give her the reality of that situation, she'll kind of learn to accept that, because she's someone who's going to be very aware that like there are just certain realities about the world that we all have to contend with, and that will kind of usually set her straight, I think. So with this Mercury being in the 8th house, the 8th house loves to go deep, very investigative type of thinker. So she, again, like when she's really finds that light bulb moment, or that thing that really grips her, she will really like almost like become obsessive about it, right? Like that's kind of, it is a little bit of like an obsessive quality. But she'll want to know everything there is to know about the subject. Now, typical subjects of the 8th house are the metaphysical, the occult, supernatural, this psychology. This is going to typically be criminology, like crime stuff. This is going to be like deviance is like linked with the 8th house as well, just because of that inherent secrecy that comes with it. There can be sex and intimacy, private relationships. So she might be very curious about sex at a very young age, right? Like this is just kind of how the cookie crumbles sometimes. So she may not openly come to you about it because it's retrograde, right? These could be things that she thinks about but doesn't express. So I wouldn't be surprised if she hits a little bit of like a stride or a peak a little earlier than normal. That would be perfectly natural for a chart like this. But throughout her youth, she'll really enjoy a good mystery. Like she'll really, really enjoy exploring the world's deeper, more mysterious aspects. And as an adult, she'll likely delve into hidden facets of human nature. So sometimes this is a strong placement for a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And I will tell you, when I was a kid, I told my mom, I have like Mercury Sun, 8th house. And I told my mom I wanted to be a psychologist. The only reason I didn't become a psychologist is because I wasn't very good at school at that age. And she was like, well, psychologists need really good grades. And like, whenever she said that, I just sort of accepted like I'd never be a psychologist. So I became an astrologer instead. It's wild. But I have a double bachelor's degree actually in psychology and criminology. So I did both. So that is, and then I ended up getting my degree / certification as an astrologer. So that is, that's a result of Mercury Sag in the 8th house. Yeah, so even if she doesn't formally study psychology, she might know a lot about psychology. And this might be sort of the key that helps her strike balance between this like Mars in the 7th square the moon in the 10th, which we'll still talk about later. That might really help her learn how to manage that, is studying human behavior so that she can understand people better. Yeah, she may not express all her thoughts verbally because oftentimes she has come across misunderstandings in the past. Thoughts can be very intricate. It can be very difficult to keep up with a brain like this. My husband, he tries so hard, he really does, but he's just like, I don't even know how you think that way. Okay, so talking about Venus. So Venus talks about what we are aesthetically attracted to, what our desires are. This is typically how we seek reward. Now, this is typically how we seek tangible reward. It depends on the sign. It depends on house placement. Sometimes this can show someone who like doesn't have a focus on tangible things. This shows typically how we are affectionate. And typically our ideals surrounding love or relationships is linked with Venus. So Venus is in Sagittarius, but this one's in the 9th house. So one of the things that we see is like a very strong link between the Sagittarius placements and the moon placement here. This can show that your daughter has this, the core focus of how she harmonizes or relates with others or relationships is that things are fair. And everybody has the freedom to be themselves. That is going to be probably one of her biggest, like, it's a deal breaker if it can't be this, right? Like, if we can't be free to be ourselves, what's the point? Like, there's no point in relationships if we can't be who we are. And honestly, it's a vibe and I'm here for it. There is a lot of tolerance and forgiveness. Venus in Sagittarius is incredibly forgiving, sometimes to a fault. But it's because of the natural optimism of the sign. It's because of the natural understanding that there's more to life and that there's always room for growth. Sagittarius people are very growth oriented and they understand these concepts from a very early age. But one of the things that will rub her the wrong way every time is unjustness or unfairness. So this is going to be like typically what grinds her gears. She'll have a great distaste, particularly if you look at where Venus is opposed. That would be like in Gemini in the 3rd house. So like people who are unjust with their words or people who are corrupt in how they teach things or how they share their ideals, like corrupt ideals or like manifestos about the world that are like absolute or like superficial, right? Like she looks to absolve herself and rise above that. This is a very, very fun, loving, laid back, outgoing Venus sign. She is really going to love attracting a lot of friends and she might be good at making friends. Keeping them little bit of a different story. And honestly, I can't tell by this chart whether she'll be, it's a possibility it could go either way. I think that she might have larger friend groups that change, like she cycles through larger friends groups, but she might have like a couple of really close friends that she keeps like for life. That's kind of what it looks like in this chart for me, because of the strong like fixed nature of Scorpio in the 7th. That's usually like 1 or 2 friends that you keep into adulthood and still keep in contact with. I definitely have friends like that I've known for like 20 years. We're not super duper close like we used to be, but we still keep in contact and we still, hit each other up and, but yeah, the cycle of friend groups definitely can change. So she is going to be someone who's going to be go, 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 very adventurous. So one thing that she might want to like spend money on, and good ways of like knowing how to like do gifts for her and stuff, or like what gestures she appreciates are things that either take something off her plate so that she has more freedom, or things that really are experience focused. So she might really love, like, instead of getting her like physical tangible gifts for holidays and stuff, like get her you could buy her like a trip to somewhere, and she would really probably prefer that or enjoy that. Or if you, let's say that's like a little bit too lofty of an ideal, like she would probably much prefer like a package for a spa day versus like you buying her a kit to do her own nails and like her own hair. Like that's kind of what we're talking about here. She could definitely have a fondness for the outdoors and nature and be very, very active. So she might really enjoy doing like activities that are like not keeping her bound in the house. I don't see her as the type of kid that just is happy and content just like being at home. And if she is, it's because like there's some sort of intellectual interest where she wants to hold herself up in a room and like listen to a podcast or like read a book or something. But like typically she's really going to enjoy exploring. Exploring is a big thing. Like seeking mystery is a big thing for someone like this. She might really artistically and creatively, she has big, big goals. Again, this is typically the idealist of the astrology Sagittarius. So they don't think small. They don't operate on a small scale. They're very, very big scale. And she can find joy in activities that typically broaden her experiences. So traveling is going to be something that she's really going to enjoy. She will also typically not be like super fond of things that are incredibly heavy on logic or data. So this shows with the moon and like the sun and Saturn, like she has the ability to like do well in those types of areas, like areas of logic and reason. But for her, like she's gonna prefer to enjoy things that are more expressive or more like movement associated. So even if she gets into some sort of like science or into some sort of like field of study and evaluation when she gets older, it'll likely be something where she feels some sense of movement or progress in some way. She could prefer ways of thinking that involve humanity or the human condition. So literature, poetry, social studies, art, those things will probably be more appealing than math and sciences. And she will constantly want to broaden her worldview. This is definitely one of those, placements where it's like, I want much more than this provincial life. It's very much like that. Okay, Mars and Scorpio in the 7th. Okay, here we go. Again, very strong-willed kid. Now, again, oftentimes with the 7th house, these are tenets we typically desire in other people. Like we reject them in ourselves, but like we really try to draw this in others. But this is definitely something that is a core tenet of hers. And she might even be conscious of it, which kind of shows a disconnect between her actions and how she thinks and perceives things. But generally speaking, she's going to have a very strong will and will communicate her desires assertively. When angry or upset, or if she's driven by emotion, she can be driven most by anger or frustration. But this is not a sign that angers quickly typically. Now, it's kind of interesting because Aries rising with Uranus is typically like that's like a hothead, right? Like typically we see that. But this actually shows with the Mars and Scorpio that she can actually hold on to anger, especially if someone close to her hurts her, or if someone close to her does her wrong. Like that is going to be the quickest way to get her fuming, like enraged. But yeah, typically when Mars in Scorpio is upset, they will oftentimes repress anger, or they'll swallow anger down, but they feel anger very deeply. So the intensity of emotional responses can be very overwhelming, especially because Jupiter is here. Jupiter's planet of expansion. So anything Jupiter's next to, it just goes like a balloon with just getting filled with helium. It just makes it even bigger. So this can show, especially because it's square the moon, she might have very strong emotional responses and she doesn't know how to handle some of those emotional responses. So the tendency is to go back to intellectualizing them. So she will oftentimes engage emotionally in her surroundings, and this can be someone who does have strong preferences, particularly about her space or how she is proactive. She just might be very, very particular. Like not much will get her up and moving unless it strikes that chord within her. So she may desire her own way pretty consistently. And one way she might try to do this is influence other people to want things that way too. It's kind of interesting. She has the power to be influential if given the opportunity to explore that. But this can oftentimes lead to disagreements and conflicts in relationships. I definitely don't think she enjoys confrontation though. That's one thing that a lot of people say Mars and Scorpio people like, but I think there's an exception when it's in the 7th house. It's like typically you don't want confrontation, but somehow you can attract confrontation. And it's because oftentimes you're doing something unconsciously that you don't realize that is attracting that, or it's because you're attracting these people into your life that have this strength that you aren't developing as much, or you're not fully conscious of. So learning to compromise is pretty crucial in order to maintain harmony in relationships. I think what also could, bite her a bit is trying to take on too many relationships or too many friendships to where she can't be truly present, or like she can't be truly engaged to the depth she wants to be in these relationships. So she has to learn to sort of like separate, like, what are my relationships where we're more like acquaintances, or we're more like we work in collaborative manner, or we're like, distantly socially linked, versus like who are like my true blue friends that I do a lot of things with. And there might be a difficulty with her being able to like dictate and prioritize the right people. That's another thing that can come out with this particular type of emphasis. But she really enjoys working with groups. That much is definitely true. She prefer to work with others versus working alone, but she'll have to resolve that tendency to want to always be in a leadership role or want to always have control in those situations, because once you start adding in more heads, or once you start adding in more bodies, it becomes more and more difficult to maintain that sense of control. So that is something that could very well crop up in this lifetime in terms of that. Sometimes people say this can lead to difficulties in marriage because of an inability to compromise. Personally, in my life, as someone who has this placement, I haven't found that to be true. But it is something that it can be associated with this placement. Okay, so Jupiter is also in Scorpio in the 7th. So a key aspect of this is delving beyond surface appearances to grasp underlying realities. So she is going to be someone, again, who is very inquisitive about other people, that really wants to learn a lot about them. And there can be a strong intensity. And sometimes this can rub people the wrong way when she's like really trying to like connect and make friends. And she just almost like she may want to go too deep too early. Now with Mercury in the 8th, she might learn to curb that a little bit, but she might come off overly eager. So she may not even be saying things to like provoke people to reveal things about themselves, but there just might be this energy about her where, it's just it's a little more than what some people can handle, which is totally fine. I think in some ways, as we get older, we learn to embrace these things about ourselves. And it's like, I'm not your person if you want just like something super lighthearted and you want something surface level and you don't want to have to like think too deeply. You don't want to, you don't want to have long, deep conversations. Maybe I'm not the person for you. But if you love that intensity and you love like feeling like we're really getting to know one another and we're relating and emotionally we're like on the same wavelength, then like if you want to kind of get that like sort of like mind body connection type of thing going, then I am that person for you. But for kids it can be hard, right? For kids it's hard. Like they want to be themselves, but they want to be accepted, and sometimes to be accepted you have to compromise and sacrifice things about yourself, and that's going to be probably what is the difficulty about this. But she, because it's in Scorpio, again, there's a lot of this seeking of the unknown. There can be an attraction to spiritual and mystical perceptions. This is a natural researcher placement as well. Very strong possibility for psychology or some sort of like study of human behavior with this. This can also be with Capricorn, Scorpio. I see a lot of people go into medicine with this, particularly not like necessarily nursing. Nursing is more like nurturing and restorative, more like diagnostic medicine. I see that combination very strongly. So that very well could be something that does come to pass. So she also might be a little bit of an old soul with this. So she might be driven to people who are older than her. And she can excel in small group settings. And again, we'll always love a sense of competition. As one gets older, of course, Jupiter does start to take on a presentation of the partner, particularly the romantic partner. So she may really sort of prefer to explore various relationships before being drawn to somebody that's more of like a stable option. So we could definitely see that play out, especially with Venus and Sagittarius. This is like someone who just like wants to really explore in terms of like love and relationships. This is not someone who's gonna like, I don't typically see this as someone who like settles down at 20 or like 18, 19 years old, like they're getting married. And if so, that's an impulsive choice and not maybe something that they really truly wanted, but there was some sort of like unconscious impulsivity or self-sabotaging behavior that made that happen. But that's oftentimes what we're going to get with this Jupiter placement. And again, this is like typically where you get rewards through the spouse or where you are spiritually rewarded. So a lot of her teachers in life come through the form of these important one-on-one relationships. So, and it's funny because the ruler of the ascendant is next to that Jupiter. So self-discovery comes through relating to others. So that's very, very strong life theme. Okay, Saturn is in Capricorn in the 9th house. So again, Saturn is typically our karma. It's like where we are tested the most. It's where we have a sense of responsibility. So it's in the 9th house. And I have this placement too. Mine's closer to my midheaven, so it greatly impacts my career as well. This will likely still impact the career because it's in the whole sign 10th house. But this is going to show that there is a sense of responsibility, of developing positive traits such as practicality, orderliness, attention to detail, organization, and a strong drive for significant achievements. So with this placement, again, there's this tendency to be able to appear more mature or wise beyond your years. And typically this is with Saturn next to the sun. One of the things that I worry about, especially because it's in Capricorn, is a strong critical eye, particularly inwardly. There can be and that might be where the beauty of Jupiter comes in terms of self-discovery, is that on her own, like when provoked by her own study and thoughts or exploring herself, in contrast to the globe or like the world, she might think very small of herself, or she might have a very pessimistic inner eye. But when relating with others, like others can kind of shine upon those positive traits that she has. So I find that to be very interesting. That I think there's so much about this chart that wants to really express itself and be incredibly bold and vivacious and alive. And I think there will be circumstances in life that will, she might hear a lot of this, like, don't do that, sit up straight, da, 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 da. Even if it's not coming from you, or, even if it's not coming from co-parents, it could come from like authority figures, and it might sort of like, kind of create this sense of being very straight-laced. And it might cause her to go, oh, because I was so like disciplined in this way, or I was told I was too much, like I was too this, I was too that. Therefore, there's something wrong with me, or there's something, like there is a struggle to like accept oneself, or there's like a struggle to continually grow in a way that's healthy, because you have to sort of like fix and rectify the inner eye. So that might be the beauty of Jupiter in this case, going back and drawing in why that Jupiter is important. So yeah, very high standards can lead to a lot of self-criticism. But typically it's the drive for this is to capitalize on one's strengths and identify them, and to use those energies efficiently. But because you're oftentimes evaluating your strengths, you also have to sort of evaluate what your weaknesses are, and sometimes you can get caught up in that. But this can show that she definitely has a strong sense of, she might have really good common sense, and she might really, in time learn to prioritize what goals are the most realistic for her to achieve, and what will have the best practical outcome. There can be an outlook on life over time that becomes cautious and more conservative, and preferring tested approaches before embracing anything new. So I find this to be true, where I oftentimes will study those that are the greats in what I do, to kind of like judge how to best move forward and progress within a certain area of interest or a field of study. I typically am not one that like wants to just like be this self-initiative and like develop my own, my own new found avenue of exploration. But her chart definitely has this dichotomy, because that Aries is typically going to always want to like do something new, or like give birth to something that like no one else has done. So resolving that conflict is going to be very interesting. But typically she'll find that success is oftentimes achieved through diligent work and systematic problem solving. There's a tendency to change opinions slowly, or change the life outlook slowly. So she might have like a life outlook, like once she kind of lands on what that is, she's gonna pretty much align with that for the majority of her life. The downside can be sometimes narrowness of thought with Saturn in the ninth, because the ninth is about like big overarching subjects that take in a lot of different perspectives and inputs, because it's like sort of like global or like universal tenets. So sometimes you have to watch out for like a dogmatic sort of energy with Saturn in the ninth. There is a tendency to become very jaded with that placement. But where she feels a sense of responsibility is to really acquire a lot of knowledge and be someone who is very well versed in what they do, someone who is a call of authority of what they do. And typically this is going to be through acquisition of knowledge or dissemination of knowledge. So this is oftentimes a placement where there is a sense of like someone being a teacher with this placement. So that could be something that we see with a placement like this. Now, you can be a teacher in all different types of professions. You don't have to like go down the route of being a like academic teacher, but that is something that is a possibility with this placement. Usually people will go into teaching or training in some capacity, but in the lifetime with this placement. Yes. Okay. So we have Uranus in the 12th. And again, I will talk about it in relation to conjuncting the ascendant here in a moment. So these outer planets are more generational. So I won't talk about them too much in depth, but I will give like a brief explanation. So she is part of a subgeneration that exhibits a strong drive for self-expression and may face challenges conforming to societal norms. So she's part of a generation that will sort of buck a lot of what is conventional and bring in newness. So individual freedom is going to be very important for this subgeneration. So sort of like doing away with this tribal style thinking is something that's very Gen Alpha. And they're going to be instilling in new societal norms because a lot of them have Pluto in Capricorn. So they will change a lot of things in terms of foundations and systems. Day-to-day practical freedom is very important. The desire for life to be spontaneous and exciting is also something that we see with this placement. But because it's in the 12th house, this is somewhat unconscious. So this can oftentimes like present as people like doing things impulsively or compulsively and like kind of like, I don't know why I did it. I just did it, right? And oftentimes because it's near the ascendant, it's like, I did it because I wanted to, or like I did it because it felt like me to do that, right? So that is something that she'll have to kind of like resolve in life, is like learning to identify like this need to sometimes like sabotage something that was consistent or stable, or this tendency to sometimes just like completely change up her identity from one day to the next. That's something that's pretty common with this as well. My oldest daughter, you can bring in my oldest daughter has this. So she's born in 2013. So it's more here in like the middle of Aries, but she's got her sun in the 6th. And this is something I see really, really prominently with her, is that she has this tendency to be like, I'm really good at this, or I'm going to be at this. And then like the next day it's something different. And there's like this constant need to almost like change the identity. Like you get bored of like, you just get bored of what you've been doing. And like, you just wake up one day and you said you want to do something else. So that's something that I've seen with that placement in particular. And there's not really like a conscious understanding of why this is. So when alone and in a private space, this is oftentimes where she'll express this freedom, particularly because Mercury is also and Venus are also in fire signs. This could be a form of self-expression, but it's one that, again, she may not express very openly, or it might be something she doesn't perceive about herself. But it could be influenced by things she's learning and discovering, or by relationships, these like changes of identity, or like these changes of what was consistent and stable. So there also can be an inclination towards unconventional studies with this, particularly with the 12th. It could be very spiritual in nature, but this can also be like charitable or altruistic interests. So there might be like a tendency towards like wanting to change things in those areas or arenas. So it's interesting because Saturn's in the 9th, which can sometimes be a stable like religion or religious outlook. But then we see also in the 12th, there is sort of like this desire to liberate oneself from some of those constraints or foundations. So this could be that there is like a big shift in spirituality or religion at some point in her life, and that's being evident or being pointed out by this. But we also see that Uranus is square Pluto in the 10th house. So there could be a big sudden career shift as well. But yeah, just, some individuals with displacement might suppress their drive for uniqueness, leading to compulsive behavior or inexplicable actions. It's essential to connect with the longing for freedom and not fear expressing the true inner self, even if there are concerns about societal disapproval. And that's because the 10th, 11th, and 12th houses make up society, or these are like the world, like integrating the individual with the world. So that is why that's something that tends to be, something that these kids do struggle with, especially when it's in the 12th house. So, and something to remember as well is that there are going to be a lot of other peers that she has that will have this Uranus in more angular house placements. So she'll see other people expressing this desire for liberation more freely. And it will be something where she feels like she can't do it freely like they can. So it'll come out in these sort of behaviors. Neptune and Pisces in the 12th house. Okay. So this is a 14-year group. With this, it takes 14 years for Neptune to go through a sign. So this particular generation will have very good intuition, receptivity, and imagination. So they will probably make really important contributions to the arts and music or any sort of creative field. And there can be a flourishing of talent and contributions that's diverse and very emotionally poignant, and fantastical is another thing. They're very influenced by fantasy. So a lot of these kids are very into like video games and like, diving into simulators and things. And that's influencing a lot of what they will do with those influences when they become adults. So religious and psychic interests are prominent with Neptune in the 12th, and Mercury in Sagittarius is extremely instinctual, extremely intuitive. If you were in the ninth house, it would almost be more so. But this shows that she has a lot of these like intuitive gleanings, but with the Aries ascendant and a lot of the angular focus, she may not rely on it when she's young or understand she's intuitive. And if she knows this, it's not something that she openly shares with others. So you can always like as a parent kind of like test these things and see like, how good her intuition is if you haven't had a chance to yet. But yeah, she'll tuning that intuition will be very important for her because that will give her a lot of insights that can actually help her in life. But she has a lot of fascination about mysticism. Neptune in the 12th house is a very positive placement. It shows that there can be a strong sympathy for others, and there might be a natural charitable sort of nature to this person. So sensitivity can allow for deep understanding of suffering and extending compassion to both people and animals. The ability to pick up impressions helps in understanding others without extensive communication. However, caution is advised regarding negative thoughts as they can have a detrimental impact. So yeah, psychological coercion is something to be very mindful of. It will be good for you to limit her exposure to things early. So I don't recommend her being exposed to a lot of like social media from a young age. Some kids can handle it really well. So I think each kid is different. With a child like this, you've got to be very careful. There's already a tendency to compare oneself to others with a chart like this, and there's a tendency to be very self-critical. So you throw social media into the mix and it's just a bad day, and you're probably going to hear a lot of why not, why can't I, hurtful words like you're ruining my life, and you're probably going to get a lot of that from her. But I do think it is important with placements like this, especially because we'll have time to go into Chiron, but Chiron's here too. Just this shows very deep psychological wounding. Like this is a kid where like almost like words can hurt more than like a physical assault for a child like this. Like words can hurt very, very deeply. This is one of those people where like almost like they go through like a scenario where they're having a conversation and like they almost hurt their own feelings. Like how sometimes like you have a dream and like your partner was really mean to you, and like you like someone wakes up and they're like, I want to punish you in real life because you were so mean to me in my dream, and the partner's like, but you dreamt it, you were mean to yourself. Like it's kind of like that. So you have to be very careful with this. Okay, and then Pluto in Capricorn in the 10th house. So this strong harbors a strong ambition to lead her peers or be a leader of her generation, aspiring to initiate meaningful changes and establish significance. Significance is it's a very important word for anyone with Saturn in Capricorn, but especially you throw Sun Pluto there. She has an overarching drive to be significant. So failure or fear of inadequacy is very big with placements like this. So lifting her up and helping her develop a way to measure herself as adequate that doesn't rely on other people is very important to establish at a young age. Pluto's placement can indicate that her life's work involves transforming and reforming the world. So this is oftentimes where you get, this is another one of those traits that is pointing towards psychology, medicine, law, or government, just personally from what I'm seeing from the chart, or changing the world in terms of like educating the world about things. So that could be journalist, that could be like a professor, educator, a doctor of academia in some way. Lots of big things for this child. Lots of really, really big, profound changes. And I find wherever Pluto is where you transform the most. It's where you have the most potential for growth. So my Pluto is in the 7th house. So by and far, starkly, I've grown a ton from where I began to now in terms of relationships, particularly one-on-one relationships and the power that they've had in my life and their ability to really help me understand myself. And I continually now work on a one-on-one basis with other people because I learn a lot through my clients as well. So that is where she's going to have a lot of transformation. Now, Pluto is a planet that you oftentimes transform through discomfort. It's sort of like you have to break down what was and like rebuild it. So this can show that the career might be stressful, or there might be just a lot of responsibility that comes with the career. But she is driven enough and she has enough strength in this chart that she can by and far do extremely well. So I would not worry too much about this, but just know that, her desire to be seen as worthy is overarching and is incredibly, incredibly poignant and huge in this chart. And it comes from a core desire of like wanting to right wrongs or wanting to make space for diversity or equity. Like it comes from a very pure place, but it will take a lot of time and effort. It's a huge undertaking. So it's also important because Ascendant is in Aries to instill tenets like patience, because no one gets to this type of result like in a day or in a year or in 5 years. This is like life work. This is like 20, 30 years of blood, sweat, and tears type of work. So it's important to kind of, have her understand that reality as well. And I think she will understand it, but there is like an internal struggle typically. But yeah, she's part of a 15-year group with Pluto in Capricorn that will have a practical and realistic approach of life. So she will actively contribute to improving the way the world works and operates. So this can be economics, business, commerce, practical affairs, vocation in and of itself, big business, pharmaceuticals, like oftentimes like essential things that everybody needs is Capricorn. Now I find it didn't apply like that for me personally, but I find my perspective of how I utilize astrology is trying to apply very practical, like services for people, like timing events or, vocational help or things like that, right? Like that's what I like to do, relocation, right? Like things that like people, they want a practical yes, no, and they want to be able to come up with a game plan based on what the astrology says. That's what I prefer to do. It's like now I truly excel actually probably more in the spiritual realm, but my drive and ambition is towards helping people make practical changes and find practical solutions. Okay, so we could probably go till 2 hours. So let me go through these other placements, these other aspects, and then I'll see if I have time to talk about transits briefly. So we have Uranus conjunct the ascendant, and this is actually retrograde. So that also makes for a very interesting Uranus. It won't operate quite as overtly. It's more subtle, but still, and this actually makes it even more unconscious, it already being in the 12th house. But Uranus conjunct the ascendant, this is a 3-degree separating aspect. So before I get too into this, there's a difference in aspects and how they work. So a separating aspect is something that it's at its peak or strongest early in the life, and then it dissipates as one gets older. Applying aspects are things that will continue to be themes or will continue to challenge you as you grow older. So the applying aspects tend to be more important, but because this aspect is so close to the ascendant, especially when she's younger, this Uranus will be very, very prominent. But as the older and older she gets, it will be something that fades more with time. And the reason why is because typically aspects, you would think of it as Uranus is moving towards the ascendant, like towards Taurus, but the way charts work is that this was the last planet to rise over the horizon. So as the day continues, the planet rises up. So it's separating from this line. So that's kind of to boil it down in simple terms. So, individuals with this aspect emphasize the right to be themselves from an early age. So they really seek independence. They prefer a lot of hands-on learning. They enjoy being actively engaged. And they enjoy learning through experience. There's oftentimes a very unique life philosophy or perspective on life, probably based on some sort of early experience or just some sort of like sentient knowing. But this can also lead to creativity and inventiveness. So enjoying new experiences and sort of doing away with what's traditional is pretty common for these people. And that's probably going to bring about the resistance of the need to develop Sun, Saturn in Capricorn. Typically, Juliana will really prefer fast-paced environments, novelty, and sort of leaving the past in the rearview mirror. This is just a child that wants to continually move forward. And they really just don't like to dwell. This actually happens in terms, so with my, even though her Uranus is not like really close to her ascendant, I find this still applies to her because it's in the same sign as her ascendant. With my oldest, I find like when we're sitting and disciplining her, God, that kid could be so patient and just sit and just listen. But like as soon as we're done with that chat, she's like, okay, bye, on to the next thing, right? Like she does not want to constantly gripe and talk and hash out things that happened in the past. I can tell it bugs her to like no end, but she will never like talk back to us. She has a very strong sort of like respect for authority. So it's just a thing that she has. So as she gets older, the more that impulsivity, the constant need for excitement and newness she will mellow out more essentially, which is cool, right? Like that's cool. So it'll feel almost like it was a phase, like a childhood phase, but it's still very much a core aspect of her. But just as time goes on, she'll gain more respect for consistency. She'll gain more respect for establishing something tangible and real. And she won't have to rely on that need for excitement as much. So Sun conjunct Saturn, this is a 0-degree partile is what we call it, applying aspect. So the Sun is at 4 minutes, Saturn's at 11 minutes. So the Sun is moving this way, even though when we're talking about aspects to the angles, the planet's moving this way. That makes sense. So the sun is moving towards Saturn. Saturn's the slower planet. Sun is the faster planet. So that's a applying aspect. So this can show someone who is serious and mature from a young age, or there's at least an aspect of her that's serious and mature. And this shows that one identifies with doing meaningful work, seeking to learn from adults and people in authority. And it can be someone who is overly demanding of themselves. So yeah, the demands may not necessarily be on other people, but there is this strong desire to become more. There could be a difficulty sometimes in enjoying youth that may lead to emotional restraint and loneliness. Over time, Juliana may find it easier to express emotions, appreciate discipline, and handle challenges. So yeah, sometimes with Sun conjunct Saturn, it's like you can't enjoy anything for too long because it's always like you got to put work first. This is definitely one of those charts where it's like, I really want it to be play first. I really, really want it to be play first, but it has to be work first. So that's something that we see with this. So another 0 degree aspect is Moon square Mars. That's a big one. Okay, so see how the moon is at 43 minutes and Mars is at 46. Moon is the faster planet. They're both at 7 degrees. So this is an applying square. Whew. So this can be difficulties controlling one's emotions or temper and reacting impulsively. And because the moon and Mars are in angular houses, which means like they're very visible, this is where the cardinal signs typically reside. These emotional dispositions are not things that are just like only people super close to her notice or only family notices. This is like people notice. Like when Juliana's upset about something, people are gonna know, right? So learning to manage disappointments or anger is really crucial. Family dynamics can play a role affecting relationships and emotional responses. So you have the ability to influence this, especially because moon is mom. Sometimes this can be like there are temperamental differences between mom and child. I've seen that happen as well. So this can be someone who is an excellent advocate for beliefs, balance, and flexibility. Clear thinking without being overwhelmed by emotions can resolve the challenges associated with this aspect. So there is, and sometimes this can be someone who acts out of character based on their emotional disposition. And I would say so when the emotions are charged, she has a tendency to just go in without thinking. Whereas if she can pull back from the emotions and process, she can detach from the intensity, and that helps her. Now, normally I would say that in this case, the Mars would typically win out because it's the stronger planet, but it definitely wins out because Jupiter's there too. Jupiter is just really like expanding that tendency. Now, one thing that's interesting though still is that because this is in the 7th house, there is this tendency to want to detach from that. So she might find herself pulling away from situations that cause this emotional outburst. But the problem with that in some ways is that this prevents her from having the opportunity to learn how to manage them. So she'll come across circumstances as she gets older in which she has no ability to pull away and then has to deal with the outcome of the emotional response. So it's good to kind of teach her while she's young how to manage this aspect before she's forced to do it when she's older. Typically Moon square Jupiter is that when she is happy, or like typically when she's feeling something, she can feel it very strongly. But there can be a fear of feeling things too strongly because the moon's in Aquarius. So this can be someone who can at times be positively inclined but have potential drawbacks. Typically this shows a friendliness or an approachability, an amiability with this placement. But there is this tendency to overdo. There's this tendency to just try to take on too much, do too much. And it will be related to the houses that it's in. So this could be overdoing activities, overspending, lack of self-control. Big one is lack of self-control, the tendency towards overindulgence. Like when you emotionally desire something, that Jupiter just makes you, it's like, it's not enough to just have a little bit, you have to have a lot of it, right? So this is in the 10th house of career and in the public, and it's also in the 7th house of one-on-one relationships. That moon is really close to the 11th house though, so I could see this playing out in terms of friendships, like taking on too many friendships and then not being able to manage them. This could be the tendency to when she's feeling really emotional or like to avoid dealing with certain emotions, she'll like overwork herself. That's a tendency with that too. This could be in relationships, this indulgence in certain aspects of love and commitment, but not wanting to fully emotionally commit, a fear of that. So it can crop up in different ways. So, but if you teach her how to manage the emotions as she's younger, she'll have less setbacks with this when she gets older. But this is a life theme. So one thing that's difficult to tell moms and dads is like sometimes these are just things they have to learn on their own, and especially because of the fire emphasis, some things just can't be told and taught. Like some things just have to be learned, and this is one of those areas where I think she's just gonna have to learn on her own. Managing the emotions, like healthy coping mannerisms, can definitely be taught because the moon in Aquarius and it's influenced by Saturn. I think that's definitely something that can be learned. But once she's in these relationships, the practical application is just something she'll have to learn how to manage that on her own. So we have Mercury square Neptune in the 8th and 12th houses. So fantasy and reality can sometimes be blurred with this placement, causing communication challenges. There can be a difficulty in expressing complex ideas verbally, which could sometimes lead to misunderstandings. Creative and imaginative, Juliana must be able in time must learn to differentiate between fantasy and reality. So avoiding mind-altering substances is crucial, as she will seek more stability later in life. And this can be a tendency this is what I mean about psychological coercion, where like an idea can be planted, and then as she explores it or as she delves into it, the information can in some ways contort the unconscious or the belief system. So it's very important you won't be able to fully control what she absorbs. And I don't like the idea of censorship. I think it's important to encourage inquisitiveness and curiosity, but there has to be an element where that happens in an appropriate way, and it should be done in baby steps. Like things should not just be like, okay, you have full reign, right? Like because you just don't know what the response might be, and this might be too that sometimes like objective facts become contorted or distorted by the subjective understanding. That could also be what this Mercury Neptune is stating. And that is an applying degree, by the way. So both the moon Mars and moon Jupiter were applying. This Mercury Neptune is also applying. We have Venus trine Uranus. That is separating, but the trines stay pretty solid throughout the lifetime. This can be someone who prefers relationships on their own terms and someone who really dislikes possessiveness. And we already see this by the sign placement, but now we also see it by this aspect. So this shows you more so this desire for control isn't a desire to necessarily control other people. It's more of a desire to control situations because this person has a particular ideal that they're looking to strike. And oftentimes the reality is little to be desired versus their ideal. So that's another thing that we see from Mercury Neptune is like she might process and think about certain situations and she has this like grand idea of how things should go, and then the reality oftentimes might disappoint her. And I think that's it's less so about her desire to control people. I do think that could still come out though with this like moon Mars and Mars in the seventh. I think that's still a possibility. But the Venus Uranus are such a big component to the life philosophy that I think that she will, if she has that issue, I think she will outgrow it pretty early on. Again, this ability to be incredibly innovative and ingenious, inquisitive, and unconventional. Seeking exciting friendships and romantic relationships are very important for development of the identity. So she'll also intrinsically understand that friendships can come and go. So she may not dwell too much on friendships changing. She might understand that's a natural process of life and might be very accepting of that. But acceptance of unique relationships can result in satisfying personal connections for her. Okay. And same thing with Venus trying the ascendant. This can be being pleasure seeking and enjoying, really seeking out what one enjoys, their natural affinities, and having artistic inclinations. And this can show a very, this can show that even though there's a strong masculinity, and not masculinity like maleness, masculinity like extroversion and, being like quite physically active, like we see that's very strong. But the Venus also shows that there is still this strong innate femininity that's expressed as well through the funnel of the ascendant, which is quite nice. There's a desirability or an attractiveness that can be that can sort of like assist in this person's ability to attract friendships and opportunities to them. Let's see. In relationships, Mars conjunct Jupiter, Juliana might be quite naturally optimistic and active, and might enjoy striking up new relationships and partnerships. This is also, it shows that this can be someone who excels in the ability to influence others. But using this wisely will be key. So she'll have to be very mindful of not trying to use this for her own gain or her own benefit, and using it sort of like as a means to help sort of attract the right kind of people to work alongside her to help change the world. Is kind of like a great way to use that aspect. So we do have Mars trine Neptune. This is also applying. So this is typically somebody who is driven by their ideals and natural sympathies. But this can show a lack of self-assertion that can hinder personal advancement. So one thing that's important is like, she might really value what her friends or peers might think of her, or she might constantly evaluate herself based on how she's perceived. And so there can be a tendency to sometimes not act or take action based on this factor. And so, or sometimes to act intuitively. So the act intuitively is more positive than the sort of like just acting just on whims or like based on the unconscious. So, but there is like a deep spiritual longing to maybe like be an advocate in some way that might be expressed in the chart as well. So she might really seek out and try to make friends with people who are typically like misunderstood, and use her influence as somebody who is like really good in social situations to kind of help that person like get comfortable in new environments. So she might be like, there might be a characteristic about her. So if that's true, you might see it happening already at school where like the teacher will say, oh, there was a new kid and they were, none of the other kids were playing with them. And, Juliana went up and kind of took their hand and took them to the reading corner, like that. That's kind of like, or, brought them in to play, tag, that's kind of like what you can see happen with that. Um, it's important to take this natural compassion and help it to foster independence rather than codependency. And that's something we see too, because Mars is the ruler of the chart. There can be a codependent tendency here. And again, this is part of the like inherent hypocrisy that can happen in human nature, right? There's such a strive to be unique and individualistic, but I kind of like want your permission first to be unique and individualistic. So we might see these flip-flops with her, where there'll be days where she's like, I'm independent, I don't need anybody to tell me. And then you might have other days where she's like, I just don't understand why they don't like me, so it's human nature. So Jupiter trine Neptune, again, can just be like inclination towards spiritual matters or creativity, or music is a big one with that. Music, especially because they're in water signs, that's a big one. So she could definitely be very interested in music or something, or art or drawing. She might be driven towards charitable activities from an early age, recognizing the power of goodness, and willing to take chances for worthwhile goals. Jupiter is also what we call sextile Pluto. This shows the doorway for opportunity for integration, whereas trine is like an easy, natural instinct. You don't really have to think about it. So this can be a catalyst for group action or small group influence, and she could definitely strive to improve conditions for herself and others. Again, showing a very strong moral code. Pluto, Jupiter is pretty big with that. I have the trine for this, and I typically do not waver from my ethics. I'm very strongly aligned with them, and for others that have this are the same. There's also this ability to maintain humility and tolerance, to avoid a sense of self-righteousness. So that's pretty important too. It's still learning to be tolerant of others. And again, there's a caution or a skepticism with Sun, Saturn in the ninth. So, but she, again, will oftentimes be rewarded by ideas from others. So this will also be something that's a little bit of a balancing act. Okay, I'm going to skip over these other ones. There weren't too many left, so that we could talk a little bit about transits before we hit the 2-hour mark, because that's probably where we do need to cut it off. So let's go ahead and talk about some transits that are coming up for Juliana. Okay, so here we have the chart again, and the outer wheel is showing what the transits are doing right now, how the planets are moving around the chart. And then the inner wheel is Juliana's chart. So these personal planets move pretty fast. They, circle the chart like once a year, like the sun. Venus also is pretty close to, it's a little over once a year, give or take. Mars takes 2 years to cross the chart, but I find that that's still pretty fast. So I like to focus on the outer planets to just kind of talk about like overarching things that are happening in the chart right now, and sort of what is to be expected from that. So one of the first things that I like to go over is like when a planet is about to hit or recently hit an angle. So Jupiter did go over the ascendant a little while ago. I want to say it's been like within the past couple months. So when transiting Jupiter does conjunct the ascendant, Jupiter is a benefic planet, so it tends to reward, or it tends to infuse a sense of goodness or jovialness with whatever area it's impacting. So with it having hit Uranus and then the ascendant, oftentimes there can be some sort of like benefit to the individual person that allows them new opportunities. Jupiter opportunities is a great word for Jupiter. Also like prosperity and abundance are great words for Jupiter as well. and wisdom is another one. It's definitely alongside Saturn. It's one of the teaching planets. So think of Jupiter as good cop and Saturn can be bad cop sometimes. So this can show that, sometimes individuals can become more sociable or more extroverted than usual. There can be like delving into new interests that really excite people during this time. Someone can begin to view themselves positively, although Jupiter does have that tendency for self-indulgence. So I wouldn't be surprised if Juliana was hungrier lately or craving more sweets. That's something that's like typical. I'm going through this transit as well, and my waistline definitely expanded during this particular period. So I have to rein it in now. But sometimes changes in the physical appearance are possible because it's the first house of self and the physical self. There can also be new learning opportunities or new travel opportunities with this as well. And that also, because the ascendant is ruled by Mars, this could have been something introduced through someone else, or possibly like a new close friendship, or like a new relationship that's going to be important entering the life of Juliana. So that is something that could also definitely happen with this transit. So Saturn is currently sextile her natal Saturn. So typically with this, we see a desire for more stability and structure, or more discipline, responsibility, and maturity can happen from this. Now, again, the sextiles are like opportunities. So there are opportunities for integration of these two things, for a harmonization of those two placements. We can see, she might be seeking responsibility, asking for some sort of responsibility, or just taking it on her own. A lot of kids around this age, if they don't have a pet when they're little, they start asking for a pet around this age. We do see that Saturn is going through the 11th house. So sometimes this can be like sort of like changing certain friendship groups, it kind of doing away with what doesn't serve us or what isn't useful to us. And that Saturn is in the 9th house. So this could be, an opportunity to connect with someone from a different background. This could be an opportunity, maybe if, because I'm trying to think, it's like, this probably went direct right around the time when the school year was starting. So this could be like connecting with a new teacher, and the teacher is influencing her dreams and aspirations, like, kind of opening up her world, like her mind, like her mindset about like what she can aspire to be, because the 11th house also deals with aspirations. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I think she was probably too young for us to go over when Jupiter was on her south node, so I won't do that for the time being. But that is an interesting transit as well. She will be coming up on, in fact, let me do this really quick and see when Saturn is going to square Saturn, because that's a big one that I'm currently going through it now with my youngest. We got Saturn square Saturn for her. We had it with our oldest a couple years ago, and yeah, that was an interesting time. Very interesting time. So Saturn will square Saturn at the Aries point. It's always the Aries point too. I didn't even have time to go into that. The Aries point is the North Node will be around there that time too. That's really interesting. Okay, so it'll happen May 27th of 2025. So a year and a half from now, she'll have Saturn square Saturn. And oftentimes what happens during this time is this is one of the first trials of Saturn that happens in a child's life, where a child will be tested and kind of gets a preview of like the overarching test needed to leave childhood and enter adulthood in a healthy way, in a holistic way. So we oftentimes can face challenges or obstacles. I would assume much of this would be internal because it's in the 9th and 12th houses, and these are more internal houses. So they're not things that are typically something that happen very publicly. There's a pressure to grow up and mature for kids at this time. Like there is like some sort of, this is one of those hard knocks, right? It's the introduction to the hard knock, and it's happening in the 12th house. So something might be revealed about a behavior that she's been doing that maybe she wasn't aware of, and she becomes aware of it and decides she wants to change it. So that's like a Saturn wanting to discipline, right? Like creating some sense of discipline. There could be authority issues that do change how she thinks and sees herself. This could be in regards to, I mean, the 9th house deals with higher education, but it could definitely still deal with education for her. So like if she's always done like really well in school, let's say. I know sometimes when Mercury is in Sagittarius, typically it represents more struggles in school, but yeah, the 3rd house is ruled by Mercury as well. But let's just say like, let's say she has done really well in school, and then Saturn square Saturn could be the first time a kid is actually challenged in school. This happened with my oldest. She's always been really good at school, and around this time she just started to really, really struggle. Like she just was having a really hard time of it. So that could be something, or she can begin to develop practical approaches that help her in terms of this area as well. Another thing about the 12th house is the 12th house is the house of our fears. So there could be a fear that is triggered during this time, and that is the challenge, learning to grapple with the fear. And the 9th house is gaining perspective on things. So that could be what the challenge is like learning to gain perspective. But I'm going to link it to Saturn's sun being in Capricorn, that need to mature, that need to organize, that need to lead in a way where you can manage and control, but you're not like asserting dominance. So I think that could definitely be in line with what that Saturn square is going to bring. Structural changes, hard work, discipline, those are all things that can tend to happen. So the transiting, let me go back now. Oops, sorry. Didn't mean to go all the way back. The transiting North Node recently went over the ascendant. So this is often a time of new beginnings that are linked with personal growth and development. This can be a call to embrace one's authenticity, especially because it's trining the North Node in Leo in the 5th. This is a struggle, by the way. This is a struggle point, the North Node Leo in the 5th. There's a fear of expressing oneself creatively. And this is because usually the fear comes from fear of not being good enough, or not like being what one aspires to. It doesn't match the ideal. So you almost like don't want to go through the process of creating or the process of expressing oneself out of fear of standing out in a bad way. A fear of not being seen as special. This could be, sometimes the South Node in the 11th earlier in life expresses like a fear of not fitting in. So that could be, that's a dichotomy we already talked about in the chart. So that could definitely be something that takes time to develop. So this could have been an opportunity recently, and we still have opportunity to work with this, where she can feel like the permission to express herself without fear of being judged. And I would say if that is happening right now in her life, like fully like cheer her on and like let her fully express herself, because issues with the South Node can be very difficult to overcome. So if there's ever an opportunity to just let that kid shine and let her create just for the sake of it and enjoying the journey and not like being super focused on like the end result, just let her do it, right? There can be the beginnings of understanding life direction with this as well. and there can be a stepping into leadership or some sort of spiritual awakening that's happening. North Node crossing over the ascendant for children, though, oftentimes is a period of self-reflection to help gain deeper understanding of the self. And so that's typically what's happening. But it can, with each child, it kind of can present in different ways. We also have Uranus square Pluto. That's a big one. That's a pretty big one. That one's a doozy. So this can be, so Uranus deals with technology, innovation, or like new discovery. So there could have been like a new discovery of some sort of like technology or social influence or media that could be influencing the house of self and contrasting with what authority figures say, or like contrasting with like what she has known. This could be a point of transformation, or a point of like, again, experimentation is really something. For a lot of kids, this is like testing different personas. Like this is, like, do I want to be the class clown? Do I want to be the teacher's pet? Do I want to be, the quiet one? Do I want to be the know-it-all, like the kid that always answers the right question? Like what mask feels good, right? So like a lot of this Uranus going through the first house is a lot of that experimentation of like, which ones feel good to me and which ones feel most like me? And then the ones that feel most like me, do I feel good like that, or do I feel too vulnerable with those? So it kind of takes on, it's a lot of this exploration. It's likely being influenced by friends, right? Or peers. That's probably a big thing happening right now. Understanding one's individual power contrasts to the structures in place. So sometimes kids start getting sassy with this, or sometimes kids start, copping toots. Sometimes kids start questioning authority. That's a big one. Questioning authority is going to be pretty big with that one. And because it's transiting through Taurus, this can be like her trying to advocate for her own comfort, because Taurus is linked with comfort, or like things that are super grounded and consistent and like incredibly concrete. So she could be advocating for things to remain the same in some way, or she could be advocating for something material, because Taurus is linked with the material as well. But Taurus is also linked with Venus, and her Venus placements in the 9th house. So again, this could be experimenting with different belief sets as well. But there is, throughout this process, there is this sort of ebb and flow between feeling empowered in her own individual efforts and also tension and conflict. The more you lean into your own power as an individual, the more you create contrast with groups, peers, or with others in general. So that could be her sort of getting a taste of that at this young age. And that's always something to kind of, come to terms with as a young kid as well. So those are like some of the big ones. That Saturn square Saturn is a big one that I wanted to point out. But yeah, we don't really have yet Uranus square the moon a while back though. So that's not, and she was so young, it probably, that was one where maybe we didn't see a lot of things happening, but she's at this like ripe age right now where like, cause she's 6, right? So just turned 6 actually. She just had a birthday, I believe. So happy birthday. But yeah, it's a lot to contend with as a kid. So lots of changes, but hopefully this reading was helpful. I was able to give you a really good dive into her chart. I could have gone on for like another 2-3 hours, honestly. Like I love charts so much. It's like you can learn so much just from these core planets. Like we didn't even get into the North Node. I didn't get into the axes as much as I wanted to. The rulerships of the houses is like another thing. Like we didn't really even get into that. And that's a lot of, you can open a whole doorway with that. didn't even get into like planets out of bounds. Like there's lots of things you can learn from the chart, but this is a pretty good dive into the chart and gives you a lot to work with. But if you have any other questions, feel free to let me know. I hope that you really, really enjoyed this reading. Anna and I will speak to you soon. Thanks. Bye.